The morning had come in cold and clear, and Constance Phelps set the tea tray herself because it pleased her to do so. It was not that there was no one else to do it. There was Mrs. Tolley in the kitchen, and the girl who came up from the village on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the old gardener who did more than gardens if you asked him politely. There were sufficient hands at Wren Cottage now, as there had not always been, and Constance was no longer obliged to carry anything she did not choose to carry. She chose the tray. She chose the china. The pale cream service with the fine gilt edge that had been Mrs. Bray's best, never used. Kept behind glass for 14 years because the woman who owned it was careful with beautiful things. She chose the fire already lit in the sitting room. The window opened precisely 1 inch to let in the November air. The chair nearest the hearth left pointedly empty. She was setting the terms of the room before the room's guests arrived. This was new to her. She had learned it, as one learns everything that does not come naturally, through sustained application and the occasional private rehearsal. The knock came at 10:30. She heard it from where she stood at the window, her hand still, her breathing even. Lady Dorothea Hemsworth was shown in first. She was 61, thinner than she had been. The diamonds at her throat the same ones she had worn to every significant occasion Constance could remember. Behind her came Miss Harriet Foyle, 23 and polished as fresh lacquer, her eyes moving over the room with a quick assessment that landed, briefly, on the gilt-edged china with something close to surprise. And behind Miss Foyle, pausing in the doorway with a stillness that was different in character from everyone else's stillness, came Julian Ashford, Earl of Murstone. He had not expected to be invited. None of them had expected to be invited. Constance turned from the window. She smiled, and the smile reached her eyes. And she knew it did because she had practiced exactly this. "Please sit down," she said. "I made the tea myself. I find it pours better when one is paying attention." Lady Hemsworth sat. Her fan opened and closed once. Constance lifted the pot. This was the part they had not planned for. She had poured tea in this woman's house for 3 years of her girlhood, and she had known, even then, that she was not quite the same order of person as the other girls who sat at that table. She had known it the way one knows a thing that has not yet been said aloud. It was only said aloud, in the end, on a Thursday evening in November, at a card party in Lady Hemsworth's blue drawing room, when the news about her father's debts reached the fashionable world, and Lady Hemsworth looked up from her cards, looked across the room at Constance, and looked away. Just that. Just the looking away. She was holding the pot now, though, and they were waiting for her to pour, and the terms had not yet been named. She poured. She let the silence sit another moment before she spoke, and the silence was entirely comfortable for her. And she knew from Lady Hemsworth's fan that it was not comfortable for Lady Hemsworth at all. "Now then," Constance said, "I believe you have all come some distance, and you will want to know what I have decided. We will get to that. First, drink your tea." It had not always been like this. That wanted saying plainly. She was 24 years old in the November that all of this played out, and she had been 20 years old when her father's creditors began to call, and the word of it moved through the county the way cold moves through old stone, quietly and then everywhere at once. Her father, George Phelps, had not been a bad man. He had been an incautious one, which is a different thing, though the world's machinery does not always distinguish between them. He borrowed against land he had already borrowed against, and he was quietly certain that a good season would set things right. And the good season did not come. By the time Constance understood the shape of what had happened, her father was negotiating with solicitors in London, and her uncle, her mother's brother, had declined to receive her calls. The uncle had 3 daughters of his own, and a very clear sense of how embarrassment spreads. The card evening at Lady Hemsworth's blue drawing room fell on a Thursday in the second November of Constance's time in polite society. She had been out one season already, a quiet season, pleasant enough, a handful of partners at the assemblies, and one genuine prospect her father's situation had made impossible. She had come to the card evening in a gown retrimmed with new lace, and the lace was good, and she had believed this would be enough. She had believed a great many things at 20 that she no longer believed at 24. The room had been bright and warm, and she had known perhaps half the people in it. She remembered the specific quality of the candle glow on the faces of Lady Hemsworth's circle as they registered the news, one by one, in the course of the evening. She remembered the exact posture of Mrs. Carver, who had always liked her, dropping her gaze to her cards when Constance passed. She remembered Miss Ainsley, who was kind by nature, saying nothing, because saying nothing felt safer than saying anything. And she remembered Lady Hemsworth, who had known her mother, who had bounced her on her knee at some long-ago birthday, who had always called her Constance and never Miss Phelps, looking up from her cards and looking away. "Surely not," Constance heard Lady Hemsworth say, low, to the woman at her elbow. "That Phelps girl here?" The woman at Lady Hemsworth's elbow had laughed, briefly and quietly, and returned to her cards. Constance had not left the room. She had considered it, and she had not done it, because leaving would have confirmed something she was not ready to confirm. She stayed until the end, and she made conversation, and she said goodnight to the host in a voice that did not waver, and she walked home in the November cold with her maid, and she did not cry until she was inside. There is a particular variety of grief that has no drama in it. It does not announce itself. It simply settles, like frost settling on a field between 1 hour and the next. And in the morning, the field is different. Her father's situation resolved itself, as such situations do, by degrees. Creditors were satisfied, partially. The house was let. The land was sold back to the bank that had financed it. George Phelps moved to a smaller house in a less fashionable county, and he died there 3 years later, not unhappily, but quietly, having made a kind of peace with what he had done and what it had cost. Constance did not have a smaller house to move to. What she had, in the months after the card evening, was a letter from Mrs. Edith Bray, who had been her mother's other friend, the less fashionable one, the solicitor's wife who had never been invited to the best card evenings and had therefore been available when the better options fell away. Mrs. Bray's letter said that she had a house too large for her and a correspondence too heavy for her eyes, and that she thought Constance sensible enough to be useful, if she was willing. Constance wrote back that she was willing. She had lived at Wren Cottage for 4 years, from 20 to 24, and she had been, in those years, precisely the thing Lady Hemsworth's circle had decided she was. The solicitors kept charity, the Phelps girl making herself useful because there was nothing else to be. If the room had given her a label, she had worn it without argument, because the room's opinion had stopped mattering to her somewhere around the 2nd year. Mrs. Bray paid her a small wage and a great deal of dignity. And the wage purchased what it purchased, and the dignity was worth more. She learned, in those 4 years, the management of a household, the reading of legal correspondence, the navigation of men who expected to be heard at length and dismissed in brief, and the specific patience required to outlast people who believed they had already decided what you were. Mrs. Bray had taught her all of it, by example more than instruction. And then Mrs. Bray had died. In September, in her own bed, at the age of 79, which was more than most people get. And she had left Wren Cottage and its contents and its small acreage entirely to Constance, with a note in her own hand, tucked into the will that read, "You earned it, my dear. Do not let them tell you otherwise." The solicitor who read the will was a Mr. Chambers, and he had done it with the particular care of a man who expected to be challenged. Lady Hemsworth had been present at the reading because she had been Mrs. Bray's neighbor for 30 years and believed, on the strength of that proximity alone, that she had some claim on the disposition of the property. She did not have a claim. What she had was an opinion, which she expressed the moment Mr. Chambers finished reading. "Surely," Lady Hemsworth said, in the voice she used when she wanted to be heard by everyone while appearing to address only one person, "the estate cannot pass to a girl with debts and no prospects of her own. There must be some provision for a more suitable arrangement." Mr. Chambers had looked at Lady Hemsworth over the top of his spectacles and said very gently, "The will is unambiguous, my lady." Constance had not looked at Lady Hemsworth during this exchange. She had kept her eyes on her hands, folded in her lap, and she had felt the particular warmth of not being surprised by a thing she had already prepared herself for. She had been prepared since August, when Mrs. Bray first told her what the will contained, and she spent 2 hours sitting very still in the garden, learning what it meant to be given something without having to ask for it. What she had not been prepared for was the letter that arrived 3 days after the will was read. It came in an envelope bearing the crest of the Murstone earldom, addressed in a solicitor's hand, and it concerned a matter of property boundaries. Specifically, it concerned the eastern pasture of Wren Cottage, which abutted the western edge of Murstone Park, and which Mrs. Bray had, 3 decades ago, quietly fenced at a line that was, according to the documents Lord Murstone's solicitor now wished to discuss, approximately 9 feet further east than the original deed permitted. Constance read the letter twice. Then she unlocked the cabinet where Mrs. Bray kept the estate papers, and she read the original deed, and the survey notes, and a second set of survey notes dated 15 years later that Mrs. Bray had commissioned herself, and which arrived at a rather different conclusion than the first. She sat with all of this for an evening, and in the morning she wrote to Lord Murstone's solicitor and said that she would be pleased to discuss the matter at Wren Cottage at his lordship's earliest convenience. Lord Murstone came himself, which was not what she had expected. He arrived on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after Mrs. Bray's death, on a gray afternoon with rain threatening but not yet falling. Constance was in the kitchen garden when the carriage came, showing old Fletcher where the ground had heaved along the far bed and wanted resetting before the frost. She heard the wheels on the gravel, and she finished what she was saying to Fletcher before she turned around, because it seemed to her important to finish what she was saying to Fletcher. The man who stepped down from the carriage was 34 years old, lean through the face, broad through the shoulder in the manner of a man who had spent time outdoors by necessity rather than by fashion. He wore a dark coat fitted close at the waist, a high white cravat, boots that had been made for function as much as appearance. His hair was a dark auburn, clipped neatly, and his eyes, when they found her across the kitchen garden, were gray with a quality she could not immediately name. She named it later as attention. He paused for a moment before he spoke. He was looking at her, and then he was looking at Fletcher, and then at the garden bed Constance had been pointing to, and then at her again. "Miss Phelps," he said. "Not a question." "My lord," she said. She pulled her gloves off as she walked toward him, and she did not hurry. There was mud on the hem of her gown, which she was aware of, and the awareness produced nothing she would have called embarrassment. She had worn mud on her hem before. It washed. He held out his hand for the estate documents she did not yet have with her, and then appeared to register that she did not have them, and lowered his hand. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. "You did not interrupt," she said. "Come inside. I have the papers in order." If you had asked Constance at the end of that first meeting whether she had noticed the Earl of Murstone in any way beyond the legal and the practical, she would have said no, and she would have been truthful, because noticing was a thing she did not permit herself in the early stages of anything. She had learned to be careful with noticing. She could not have explained precisely the way she was aware of exactly where he was in the sitting room when she turned to lift the deed from the cabinet, or the way her breath came differently when he leaned over the table to look at the survey notes, and his shoulder was 6 inches from hers. The body keeps its own accounts. She was not ready yet to read them. They spent 2 hours over the papers and arrived at nothing decided, which was, Constance suspected, the honest outcome of papers that were genuinely ambiguous. He was precise in his questions, and he listened to her answers in a way she was not accustomed to, a listening that appeared to involve actually waiting for her to finish before he responded. She found this notable enough to file away without comment. He said, on leaving, "I will need to return. The survey notes want a closer examination than one afternoon permits." "Of course," she said. "Next week," he said. It was not quite a question. "Next week is convenient," she said. He returned the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. By the third visit, she had asked Mrs. Tolley to put out the good china. He came on Tuesday afternoons, and he stayed until the light went, and they talked about the papers, and then about other things. Because two people who are both precise in their language and unaccustomed to being listened to will eventually find other things to talk about. She told him, one afternoon in the 4th week, about Mrs. Bray, about what the woman had been and what she had given her. And she did not make it sentimental because it was not sentimental. It was a fact of her life, one of the better ones. He listened without interrupting. The following Tuesday, he was quieter than he had been, and she did not ask about it. And near the end of the afternoon, he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a small oval miniature, which he set on the table between the survey documents. Without a word. The portrait was of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes very like his own, and a mouth that appeared to have been caught mid-smile. "My sister Charlotte," he said. "She died 2 years ago, in childbed. I was in Portugal." Constance looked at the miniature for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You received word after," she said. "Not a question. 3 months after. By the time I knew, there was nothing to return for." She did not say that she was sorry, because the word felt thin against the specific weight of what he had named. She said, "That is a particular cruelty. The kind that has no one to account for it." He looked at her. It was the kind of look that had a quality of stillness to it, the way a flame sometimes goes very still before it bends. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what it is." She felt the warmth begin somewhere below her sternum, quiet as the first day of a season change, and she did not acknowledge it because she had learned, long ago, the cost of acknowledging warmth in the wrong direction. If you are listening to this story, and you have spent any time in the careful management of hope, you know what the next several weeks were. You know the way a person begins to mark certain hours by the presence or absence of a sound she has learned to expect, the creak of a particular carriage on a particular gravel. You know the way the body votes, steadily and without her permission, against everything she has trained herself to keep at a distance. If any part of this is familiar to you, leave a word in the comments, because Constance Phelps would have liked to know she was not the only one who found the arithmetic of wanting so very inconvenient. She told herself it was a practical arrangement. They were two people with a shared boundary dispute and a mutual interest in its resolution. She told herself his attention was the attention of a man who was methodical by temperament, and she happened to be in the vicinity of the method. She told herself this across 4 Tuesdays with diminishing conviction, and then she stopped telling herself things because the 5th Tuesday he had stayed later than usual, And in the hallway, at the moment of leaving, he had turned back from the door for no apparent reason. And they had stood in the narrow corridor for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last, and his hand had moved, just slightly, toward hers, and stopped. He had said good night and left, and she had stood in the hallway for a long time, her hand in the air where his hand had not quite reached it. She let herself feel it. She let herself feel, for the first time in 4 years, the specific quality of being attended to by someone whose attention was worth something. It was warm and it was frightening, and she held it in both hands very carefully, the way you hold a thing you are not sure you will be permitted to keep. The county assembly was held in the 3rd week of November in the assembly rooms at Farthing Cross, which was the same assembly at which Constance had danced twice in each of her 2 seasons, and where she had been present, on the last occasion she attended, when Lady Hemsworth cut her at the door. She had not intended to go. An invitation had come by virtue of her new position as householder of Wren Cottage, and she had looked at it for 2 days before writing her acceptance, because there was a version of herself that wanted to see how it felt to stand in that room as something other than the thing the room had decided she was, and she was not certain whether that was courage or foolishness. She arrived in her best gown, which was not the finest gown in the room, and she was aware of the assessments occurring in her vicinity as she made her way through the company. Several people nodded. A few looked longer than they might have. She saw, across the room, Mrs. Carver, who had dropped her gaze at the card party 4 years ago, and she watched Mrs. Carver calculate something before crossing the room to greet her, warmly, with an expression that wanted very much to appear as though it had always been warm. She did not see Lord Murstone when she first entered the room. She did not look for him, which required a disciplined management of her attention. She found Miss Harriet Foyle at her elbow instead, which was not what she had been managing her attention for. Miss Foyle was 23 and very well turned out, and in possession of a complexion that had never been asked to weather much. She was accompanied by Lady Hemsworth, and her expression, as she looked at Constance, contained the specific variety of sympathy that is not sympathy at all. "Miss Phelps," Lady Hemsworth said, and Constance noticed the sound of her own name in that voice, the faint pause before it, the implication that the name itself was something requiring management. "What a surprise! I had not thought to see you among the company this evening." "I live here," Constance said pleasantly. "Indeed." Lady Hemsworth opened her fan. "You have done very well for yourself, I understand." "Mrs. Bray's little estate." "A very comfortable property," Constance agreed. Lady Hemsworth's gaze moved over her shoulder, found what it was looking for, and came back with a faint satisfaction in it. "I believe you have met Lord Murstone, in connection with some business matter. They say he has been calling at Wren Cottage rather regularly." She let this sit for a moment, with the skill of a woman who has been letting things sit for 40 years. "I should not read anything into it, my dear. The estate business must be settled by someone. He has other, more settled arrangements." She glanced at Miss Foyle, briefly and deliberately. Constance looked at Miss Foyle. Miss Foyle looked back at her with the expression of someone who has been told they are winning, but is not entirely sure of the scoring. "They say she was the kept charity of old Mrs. Bray," Miss Foyle said, to no one in particular, in a voice precisely calibrated to be heard. "The solicitor's dependent." It was a good line. Constance gave it that. She was looking across the room for Julian Ashford. She found him speaking with a group of men near the windows, his back half turned to the gathering, and she watched as Lady Hemsworth moved through the crowd toward him with the patience of a woman who has engineered social outcomes for 4 decades and does not require a hurry. She did not hear what Lady Hemsworth said to him. She saw his face in the moment he became aware of the situation being constructed around him, a particular quality of stillness that she was beginning to read. And she waited, her hands loose at her sides, for him to say something. He did not say something. Lady Hemsworth had turned to the room with the composure of a woman who has just announced what everyone already knew. And she said, in her pleasant, carrying voice, "I believe we are very soon to offer congratulations to Lord Murstone and Miss Foyle. The attachment has been understood for some months now." The room murmured. Heads turned. Constance watched the murmuring reach the edges of the room and fold back on itself. Lord Murstone was standing very still. He did not look at Lady Hemsworth. He did not look at Miss Foyle. For a moment she thought he might look at her, but she did not stay to find out. She set her glass down on the nearest table with the care of a person who is managing something that wants to be less managed, and she moved, steadily and without hurrying, toward the door. The night air was cold, and she stood in it for a moment before calling for her carriage. She had been here before. Not in this particular room, at this particular hour, but in this territory. The territory of understanding. Again, that she was not the kind of person certain rooms were designed to hold. She had learned, in the 4 years between the last time and this one, that the only answer to such a lesson was continued motion. You did not stop. You went home, and you slept. And in the morning, you picked up the thing you were doing before the interruption, because the alternative was to let the interruption mean more than it deserved. She had believed, for 6 weeks, that something was being built. She supposed she had been wrong about that, the way she had been wrong about a number of things. She sat in her carriage on the drive back to Wren Cottage, and she looked at the dark fields going past the window, and she told herself, firmly and without sentimentality, that this was not a disaster. It was an inconvenience. It was a boundary dispute that would be settled by solicitors, and a proximity that had been, perhaps, warmer on her side than his. These things happened. You recalibrated. You returned to your work. At home, she sat for a long time at Mrs. Bray's writing desk, in the small pool of candlelight. And she thought. She thought with the particular clarity of a person who has had the warmth taken out of the room and can therefore see the furniture plainly. She thought about what she actually had, and what she had done with it, and what she had not yet done. She thought about the second survey, and about certain other documents in Mrs. Bray's cabinet that she had read carefully and set aside, and about the specific legal language in those documents, and about what a person in her position was actually entitled to ask for. She was not without options. She had simply not, until now, been paying sufficient attention to them. In the morning, she wrote 2 letters. The first went to Mr. Chambers, her solicitor, outlining her understanding of the boundary documents and the action she wished to take on the basis of them. The second went not to Lord Murstone, but to his solicitor, a Mr. Parish. And it was written in the careful language of a woman who has read a great deal of legal correspondence and knows what words mean and what they cost. She wrote that she was prepared to resolve the boundary matter definitively and to relinquish any counterclaim arising from the second survey in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of the terms she intended to set. She wrote that she would receive interested parties at Wren Cottage on the following Thursday morning at 10:30. She wrote that she hoped all persons relevant to the matter would attend, and that she would provide tea. She sealed it and sent it. And then she went into the kitchen garden and spent an hour with Fletcher resetting the frost-heaved bed, which wanted doing and which cleared her head, Thursday came with the same cold clarity as every other morning that week, and Constance set the tray herself and chose the good china and left the chair nearest the fire for Lady Hemsworth, who had bad knees, which Constance knew because she had known the woman since childhood, and some things persisted beyond the point at which they were welcome. The knock came at 10:30. Lady Hemsworth came in first, and then Miss Foyle. And then, pausing in the doorway with his grey eyes finding her across the room before anything else had happened, Lord Murstone. He had not expected to be invited. This was visible in the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his stillness, something new in it that she could not immediately read. She smiled and poured and let them settle, and when they had been sitting long enough for the tea to do what tea does, she set down the pot and folded her hands and looked at them. "Now then," she said, "I have asked you here because there is a matter of some complexity that I believe we are all in a position to resolve, and I should like to resolve it plainly. Mr. Parrish." She addressed the solicitor, who had arrived quietly behind the others and taken his place near the window. "You have reviewed the documents I sent?" Mr. Parrish confirmed that he had. "And the counterclaim arising from Mrs. Bray's second survey is sound?" He confirmed that it was. Lady Hemsworth's fan opened. "I fail to see what any of this has to do with me." "You are here," Constance said, "because you have an interest in the resolution. Wren Cottage and Murstone Park share a boundary, as you know, and you share a boundary with both of them. If the second survey holds, the fence line moves, and the lane that runs through your eastern property reverts to shared access. This would be inconvenient for you." She paused. "I imagine it would be quite inconvenient for you." Lady Hemsworth's expression shifted into something that wanted to be outrage and was having trouble finding its footing. "Miss Phelps," she said, in the voice she had been using to address people of lower station for 61 years, "surely you cannot think to do this." "I am not thinking, Lady Hemsworth," Constance said pleasantly. "I am telling you what I have decided. The counterclaim will not be pursued, and the fence line will remain as it stands, and the lane will remain as it stands. And this whole matter will be settled with no inconvenience to anyone." She reached for her cup, took a small sip. "In exchange for one thing." The room was very quiet. Miss Foyle was looking at her, with the expression of a woman who has arrived at a card party expecting to win, and is only now registering that she has misunderstood the game. "You will be gracious," Constance said. "All of you, in this room, and in every room that matters, to every person you have decided was beneath your notice. Not to me, specifically. That ship has sailed, and I am not asking for anything personal. I am asking you to use what you have, the influence you have worked very hard to cultivate, on behalf of the people who do not have it. Specifically," she set her cup down, "you will sponsor the Mrs. Aldred for the coming season. Their father was my father's clerk, and their situation is not unlike what mine was, and they deserve a better introduction than they will get without your name behind them." Lady Hemsworth stared at her. "That is the whole of it," Constance said. "I am not asking for more than that. I think it is not an onerous requirement. And in return, the lane stays, the fence stays, and we are all comfortable." She was aware, in the silence that followed, of Lord Murstone. She had not looked directly at him since the opening of the meeting. She looked at him now. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and she could not immediately name it, except that it was not the expression of a man who was discomfited by what he was watching. It was something else entirely. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she returned her attention to Lady Hemsworth. "Well?" Lady Hemsworth said at last. Her fan closed with a small, definitive click. "You have not changed, Constance. You were always a very strange girl. I was always a very precise one, Constance said. You mistook them for the same thing. The meeting concluded in the way meetings conclude when everyone knows what the answer will be, and the answer is not the one most of them wanted. Lady Hemsworth agreed, in the careful language of a woman capitulating to something she cannot afford to refuse, and she left with Miss Foyle behind her, and Mr. Parrish gathered his papers and took his leave, and Constance was alone in the sitting room with the cold tea and Lord Murstone. He had not left with the others. He had waited, in his particular way, standing near the window with the gray November light behind him. And when the sound of the others' carriages had faded, he crossed the room slowly and sat down across from her, without being invited, which she noted. You should have told me, he said. She looked at him. I am telling you now. At the assembly. His jaw was tight. When she said that, in the room, I should have stopped her. You did not know what you should have done, Constance said. Neither did I, in the moment. That is the nature of moments arranged by people who know how to arrange them. Miss Phelps? He stopped. He took a breath. Constance. He said her name the way you say a thing you have been holding for a long time. Not casually. I need you to understand that He stopped again because he was a man who did not rush his sentences, and she had learned to appreciate this about him. I know, she said. You cannot know, he said. I have not said it. I know enough, she said. The rest can be said in sequence. Something shifted in his face. The severe mouth moved, and it was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, in the territory of it. You are managing me, he said. I am pacing the conversation, she said, because you are going to say something I want to hear clearly, and I need to finish my tea first. He watched her lift her cup. He watched her drink. He watched her set the cup down with the same care she had used for the teapot at the start of the meeting. Now, she said. Go ahead. He said what he had to say, in the exact sequence the county assembly required him to say it, because there were forms, and he had observed them long enough to know their value even now. He said that he had understood his own heart on the drive back from the assembly on the night she left, and that understanding had been, he admitted, somewhat late, and he was not asking her to excuse it, but he was asking her to hear what it had led him to. He said that there was nothing settled with Miss Foyle, that there had never been anything settled, that Lady Hemsworth's campaign was precisely that, a campaign with no substance beneath it, and he had not contradicted it in the room because he had been too slow, and he intended to correct that wherever it needed correcting. He came that afternoon to the county assembly rooms, where the company was still gathered for the evening's second event, because the assembly ran to dinner, and a public gathering was still a public gathering. He walked in through the main doors at 6:30, which was a thing that produced its own quality of attention, and he crossed the room with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided on something and does not intend to be stopped on the way to it. Lady Hemsworth was seated near the fire. Miss Foyle was at her elbow. The room saw him coming before he arrived, and the room knew what was happening before it happened, because rooms always do. He stopped beside Constance, who had returned at 6 in a different gown, the dark green one that had been Mrs. Bray's gift last Christmas and which fit her properly, and he did not say anything for a moment, only stood beside her in the specific way that says a thing more clearly than words. Then Lady Hemsworth, who could never leave a silence untouched, said, Lord Murstone, I had hoped you might join us this evening. Miss Foyle has been waiting. Miss Phelps is my intended, he said. Adjust accordingly. 7 words. Short, level, irrevocable. The room went very still. Lady Hemsworth's fan opened and did not close again for a long moment, because there was no social maneuver available to her that covered a public declaration delivered in that voice, in that room, in front of that many witnesses. The fan was the last position she had, and it was not sufficient. Miss Foyle looked at Lord Murstone, and then at Constance, and then at Lady Hemsworth. And the reading on her face was quick and accurate, and she took a small step back, which was, Constance thought, entirely sensible of her. The crowd that had been watching turned collectively to Constance. She did not look triumphant. She was quite certain of that, because she had thought about this moment and what it would require of her. And what it would require of her was not triumph. It was simply a continuation of the thing she had been doing for 4 years. The thing that had not changed. She accepted, with grace, what she had earned. She looked at him and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "You will need to speak to Mr. Chambers." "I know," he said. "And I have conditions," she said. "I expected nothing less," he said. The green gown and the gray eyes and the cold November room were the last public arena she would stand in as a woman who did not yet know where she was going. From here, the path was settled, and the settlement was chosen, and the distinction mattered more than she could say. Lady Hemsworth, to her credit, did not create a scene. She had been publicly corrected rather than publicly destroyed, and she had enough left of the dignity she had spent a lifetime assembling to absorb the correction with a degree of composure. She inclined her head once in Constance's direction before the evening ended. It was not an apology. It was a recognition, which was, in the circumstances, the more honest thing. Winter came properly to the county in the first week of December, the kind of winter that settles in without apology and expects to be taken seriously. The drawing room at Wren Cottage was warm in the way only a room with a fire and the right person in it can be warm. Constance sat in the chair by the window with the small volume of verse in her hands, the one that had been her mother's, the one with the pale blue ribbon threaded through it at the second poem from the last. She had moved the ribbon forward to mark a different page, and she noticed this as she opened the book, the way the ribbon rested now at a page she had chosen rather than the one it had been left at. Julian was at the desk across the room, writing something to his solicitor, which she knew because he had told her what he was writing, which she noted as one of the things she had not expected to receive, the small, ongoing gift of being told. The fire settled with a sound like a quiet breath. Outside, the first snow of the season was moving in from the north, a fine gray curtain of it drawing across the fields. She looked up at him. He was not looking at her, but she knew, from the specific quality of his stillness, that he was aware of her looking. She returned to the poem. The pale blue ribbon lay across the page like something her mother had placed there specifically for her, which it was, in the way that all small, faithful things are placed there specifically for the people who eventually find them. She did not move the ribbon again. She did not need to. She had found the page she was on.